She blinked, and something moved inside her eye. It wasn't her imagination. It wasn't fatigue. It wasn't dust. It was alive. What seemed like a simple itch turned into one of the most bizarre cases in modern medicine. A healthy woman, living an ordinary life, began to feel something strange, a slight tingling sensation in her right eye. At first, she thought it was just an allergy. But within days, the discomfort turned into agony, and the mirror began to reveal the impossible. Beneath the surface of her eye, something was moving. This story took place in the United States. Her name is Abby Beckley. She was 26 years old and working on a fishing boat in Alaska when it all began. She had no idea she was about to become the first recorded patient in history with a condition no one ever expected to find in humans. What doctors discovered in her eye defies everything medicine thought it knew about parasitic infections. And the most terrifying part? She wasn't infected in some distant country or exotic jungle. The parasite was closer than anyone could have imagined. If you're into real stories that defy logic and push the limits of the human body, hit subscribe. But be warned, what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Let's go back to the beginning, to the first sign that something was terribly wrong. It was summer in Alaska. Abby Beckley spent her days working hard on a commercial fishing boat. The environment was humid, salty, windswept, but nothing she wasn't used to. Strong, determined, and no stranger to challenges, Abby wasn't the type to be rattled easily. But that day, something was bothering her. It started with a mild irritation in her right eye. A fleeting sting, barely noticeable. Abby rubbed it, blinked, tried to ignore it. She figured it was just the wind blowing in some dust, or maybe an eyelash out of place. But as the hours passed, the sensation grew worse. It turned into itching, then burning, and then a strange tingling, like something crawling beneath her skin. The next morning when she woke up, the discomfort had become unbearable. Her eye was slightly swollen, red, and seemed to throb. In the mirror she saw something more. A thin whitish line, almost transparent, nestled in the lower corner of her eye. She touched it, and the line moved. Frightened, Abby carefully pulled it out. What came out of her eye was enough to make anyone scream. It was thin, almost invisible, just a few centimeters long. And it was moving. It was a worm. Alive. But she didn't scream. Abby went into shock. She placed the tiny parasite on a tissue, threw it in the trash, and tried to convince herself that it couldn't be real. Maybe it was a thread, a hair, a grotesque coincidence. But deep down she knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. In the following days, she started having trouble sleeping. The itching returned. The burning intensified. And every time she looked in the mirror, that same faint line seemed to be there again, as if it were being replaced. Reborn! She decided to tell a crew member. They laughed, made jokes. No one believed her. "Maybe it's just a worm of your imagination, Abby," they said. But she wasn't imagining anything. She removed the next worm on her own, in silence. Then another. And another. In total, she pulled out 5. With no immediate access to hospitals. After all, they were out at sea. Abby decided to wait until they returned to shore. But something had already changed inside her. Fear began to creep in. Because this wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was a threat. And it was alive inside her. What she didn't know yet was that her body had become home to a species that doctors had never imagined finding in a human eye. And the worst was still to come. When Abby finally returned to dry land, she did what any sensible person would do. She saw a doctor. She arrived at the clinic with red, tired eyes and a shattered soul. She carried with her not only the memory of what she had pulled from her own eye, but also a growing sense that something was still in there. The doctor examined her. He used a flashlight, flipped her eyelids, asked her to blink. Then he shook his head, almost frustrated. "There's nothing here, miss." She insisted. She talked about the worm, described what she saw, what she felt. The doctor smiled skeptically. Maybe it was a hair, or some leftover eye discharge. That can happen. But Abby knew that wasn't discharge. That thing moved. Dismissed, she went home. And that night, she decided to record a video. She placed her phone in front of the bathroom mirror, pulled down her lower eyelid, and waited. Nothing. She blinked. Nothing. Then, suddenly, something slid slowly across the surface of her eye. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but visible. She repeated the process for days, and each time she saw the same movement. A faint, translucent strand that rippled like a worm swimming beneath glass. She started taking photos, filmed at different times. She was afraid to show anyone, worried she'd be seen as delusional. But something inside her whispered, "Document everything, because no one else will see what I see." Fear gave way to obsession. She started checking the mirror obsessively. Every hour, in different mirrors, under different lighting. She even began dreaming about it. In her nightmares, the worms were bigger. They had teeth. They whispered. 2 weeks passed, with the agonizing feeling that something alive was living inside her eye, until she managed to get another appointment, this time with an ophthalmologist, a specialist. Abby came armed with all the photos, videos, and her detailed account. And for the first time, someone took her seriously. The doctor adjusted the slit lamp microscope, asked her to rest her chin, and gently opened her eye, then froze. "There's something here," he said. His voice almost trembled. Abby didn't know whether to feel relief or terror, but in that moment, everything changed. The specialist used a fine surgical tweezer. With extreme care, he extracted a gelatinous filament from her eye. He placed it in a small vial with sterile solution, and there, in front of everyone's eyes, the filament twisted. It was a worm, alive. The room fell silent. The doctor called in more professionals. No one said a word, because none of them had ever seen anything like it. From that moment on, Abby Beckley was no longer just a patient. She became an international medical case. And the fight had only just begun. What do you do when your body becomes home to something that should never be there? Abby didn't have that answer, and now that the doctors were alert, neither did they. The parasite removed from her eye was rushed to a lab for analysis. While awaiting the results, she underwent a barrage of tests. Bright lights, magnifying lenses, contrast dyes, eye dilation. She felt like a lab rat. But at the same time, she knew this was her only chance to understand what was happening. The specialists didn't hide their shock. In hushed hallway conversations, they admitted they'd never seen anything like it. It wasn't just the presence of a worm in her eye. It was the kind of worm. When the lab results finally came in, they revealed something that sent chills down even the most seasoned professionals. The parasite was from the species Thalassea gulosa. The reaction was immediate. That's not possible. Thalassea gulosa is a type of eyeworm that, until then, had only been documented in cattle, cows, in rural areas of the United States, never in a human being. It's a parasite that feeds on the lubrication of animals' eyes, living under the eyelids and reproducing there, quietly. But in that moment, for the first time in recorded history, a human had been infected. And more than that, Abby didn't just have one. Over the following days, doctors removed a total of 14 live worms from her eyes. 14. Each one measured between 1 and 2 centimeters, translucent and squirming. They hid between the eyelid and the eyeball, sometimes behind the tear duct, as if they knew the terrain perfectly. The extractions were done manually, one by one, without general anesthesia. Abby had to keep her eye open, completely still, while doctors used micro-forceps to carefully remove the parasites. Any sudden movement could cause permanent damage, she cried. Not just from the pain, but from sheer panic. During one procedure, a doctor whispered, "This feels like a horror movie scene." And it was, except it was real. And Abby was the lead character. Meanwhile, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, got involved. The case was unprecedented, urgent. Scientists began investigating how this could have happened. The most likely theory? Flies. Thalassiya gulosa depends on flies that feed on eye secretions, and those flies can accidentally carry larvae from one infected animal to another. Since Abby worked in a rural, maritime environment, her contact with animals and insects was constant, but none of that brought her any comfort. Because while the experts debated possibilities, she was still falling asleep, afraid, because the deepest fear wasn't that a new worm might appear, it was that they might still be there. When the first videos of the worm removals began circulating among researchers, Abby's case stopped being just a rare diagnosis and became a global headline. The CDC authorized full documentation. A camera was installed during the procedures, and what it captured went beyond the limits of science fiction. In close-up, you could see the tiny translucent filaments being slowly pulled from inside her eye. Some squirmed. Others remained still, as if patiently waiting for the right moment to escape. The footage spread around the world. Prestigious medical journals published articles. Mainstream outlets like the New York Times and BBC ran shocking headlines. It was impossible to look away, and equally impossible to watch without wincing. Abby, who had never asked for attention, suddenly found herself in the eye of the storm. Doctors wanted interviews. Researchers requested samples. Universities asked for permission to present her case at medical conferences. Overnight, her right eye, the one that had been invaded, became a symbol. But fame brought no relief. Each time the story aired, Abby relived everything. The pain, the fear, the sleepless nights. The sensation of something moving where no life should exist. Behind the headlines was a young woman trying to understand what had happened to her body and how to move on. She began avoiding social media. Cruel comments started appearing. People called her worm woman, parasite eye, freak. The public, caught between fascination and mockery, forgot there was a real person behind the story. Someone who had bled, suffered, and carried silent terror for weeks. But Abby was stronger than they imagined. She agreed to give an interview. She showed her scans, told her story calmly, but didn't hold back her emotion. She spoke about the moment she saw the first worm writhing on a tissue. About how it felt to not be believed. About the horror of pulling something alive out of her own eye with her own fingers. And then she did something unexpected. She donated the footage of the procedure to medical universities. She asked that her case be used to raise awareness among doctors about rare infections. She wanted to make sure no one else would go through what she had, especially without being taken seriously. The video of the removal was shown at medical conferences across the US, Canada, and Europe. The name Abby Beckley began appearing in scientific articles as the first documented human case of Thalassiya gulosa eye infection. It was history, real, unbelievable, alive. And even with all that exposure, there was one thing no camera could ever capture: the invisible scars the experience left behind. The body healed, so did the eye. But some wounds don't show up on scans. After the last worm was removed, Abby went through months of follow-up care. There were no signs of new parasites. Her eye lubrication returned to normal. Her vision remained intact. The doctors smiled. "You're fine," they said. But Abby didn't feel fine. She would wake up in the middle of the night with a sensation that something was crawling behind her eyelids. She'd run to the bathroom, look in the mirror, turn on the lights. Nothing. But the fear was real. In her mind, there was a dark space where logic no longer applied. A place where the impossible had already happened once, and could happen again. She developed anxiety, a phobia of flies. She started wearing protective glasses even on cloudy days. She was afraid of humid environments, afraid to touch her own eyes, afraid of strong wind. And, more than anything, she was afraid of not being heard. Afraid of not being believed. Afraid of feeling that same crawling sensation again, and having no one take her seriously. The psychological trauma was just as deep as the physical one. Abby sought therapy. She spoke with psychologists, psychiatrists, specialists in medical trauma. She was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Because yes, the human body can host the unimaginable. But the human mind isn't always ready to accept what it's seen. Doctors learned a lot from her case. But she learned something no school could teach: The cruelest fear is the one that lives inside us. And in the silence she began to find strength. She returned to work, cautiously. She learned to live with the curious stares, the whispers. She became a case study, a warning, and, to many, a symbol of courage. Medicine advanced because of her. New protocols were developed to detect rare ocular infections. Other patients were diagnosed earlier thanks to the awareness her story created. Abby, unintentionally, became part of something bigger. But there were still nights when she'd fall asleep with a towel over her eyes. Like a symbolic shield. A reminder that sometimes protection isn't physical. It's emotional. She never took her eyes off herself again. Literally. And perhaps that's the most chilling part of this entire story. The parasite was gone, but the fear remained. Abby Beckley's case was unique. But what it revealed is universal. We live believing we know our bodies, that we can sense, predict, and identify when something is wrong. But what happens when the enemy is silent, transparent, almost invisible? And what if no one believes you? Her body became a home, her eye, a shelter. Her pain, a secret language only she could understand. And still, she was dismissed, ignored, labeled, until the truth, quite literally, came to light. She was the first, but she won't be the last. Medicine has advanced, yes, but there is still so much we don't understand about what lives, or could live, inside us. Worms that cross species, diseases that don't ask permission, fears that science doesn't yet know how to name. And the question that lingers is this: what if it were you in that hospital bed, looking into the mirror, and seeing something move inside your own eye? If this story moved you, subscribe now to Medical Mystery Files. Medicine still holds secrets you need to discover. And the human body is a frontier we don't always know where it begins or where it ends.